My name is Alyssa, and for our Civil Liberties project, we chose freedom of speech and the press. This is in the U.S. Bill of Rights, and it's the First Amendment adopted in 1791. And it reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. A constitutional provision is a specifically designated rule or law within a nation or state's constitution. Provisions cannot be changed through court or common law regardless of the circumstances that may arise. Instead, constitutional principles are a basic blueprint of how the country or state governed by that constitution will be run. If provisions are to be changed, they must undergo a specific process, which requires approval by both the U.S. Congress and ratification by the states. The founders made it incredibly difficult to change the amendments in our Bill of Rights because they thought that this was the most basic foundation of our society moving forward and away from their previous government before coming to North America. The First Amendment regarding freedom of speech and the press is very broad. It's not incredibly specific, and individuals are given a lot of wiggle room to interpret this amendment. With that being said, it is one of the most widely understood amendments, even if there are many interpretations.
The First Amendment guarantees freedom of speech. But does that mean we're allowed to say anything we want? Well, not quite. The limits on free speech come from the basic principle that you're not allowed to harm others to get what you want. You can win in the marketplace with better goods and lower prices, and even put your competition out of business. But you're not allowed to use speech to threaten to hurt someone, either verbally or non-verbally. And you're not allowed to deceive people to get what you want. That's called fraud. You'd be harming them because they're relying on false information. Free speech means you can proclaim your beliefs and passions, argue your opinions, and speak out against what you consider to be injustices. As long as you don't defame or abuse people, or advocate the immediate use of force, or intentionally misrepresent the truth to people, you have the freedom to share whatever is on your mind.
Throughout the history of the United States, the Supreme Court has made a number of significant rulings regarding the subject of free speech. One very important case was the New York Times v. Sullivan. The importance of this case is that public officials were no longer allowed to sue individuals for defamation. This was a problem of sorts because writers or publications could be sued for defamation for an article that showed him in a bad light, even though it may or not be true. Due to this landmark decision, journalists or publications did not have to worry about the repercussions of criticizing a public official. Journalists aren't paid as well as some of these powerful politicians, and they can make their life a living hell by, suing them. Attorney alone can cost thousands and thousands of dollars, which is, a headache for anyone, especially when someone's trying to do their work in journalism. Another really important case in regard to the subject of freedom of speech and expression was Tinker v. Des Moines, which was a case where 5 students at a school in Des Moines, Iowa, showed up to school wearing a black armband to protest the Vietnam War. This wasn't something that occurred too often at the time, and I assume the public official or the teachers didn't know what to do with it, and it was a very important decision by the courts. Tinker versus Des Moines was a very important case due to the fact that it allowed students to protest while in school. This was a subject that, hadn't really been touched upon until then. People would protest, but could you protest in a school, in a government building? Would that be allowed? Obviously, the courts said it was, and it set a precedent that allowed students to do what they wanted in a school grounds, which they should be able to, just because it's a way for them to express themselves. This case established that freedom of expression was protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution. This wasn't something that was guaranteed by the Constitution. It wasn't exactly stated, but the judges on the Supreme Court decided that this was an important part of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, which I think it is. You should be able to protest anything almost anywhere as long as you're not obstructing anyone or harming anyone. It's peaceful protest is encouraged and has happened throughout this country's history numerous times, and it should be encouraged as long as you're not affecting anyone's livelihood or life.
I'm going to talk about relevant Supreme Court decisions surrounding freedom of speech and the press. The first case I'm talking about is the freedom to choose your words, Cohen versus California. Cohen was arrested for wearing a jacket to court that said "fuck the draft" during the Vietnam War. And the lower court decisions had arrested him and sentenced him for 30 days because they believed Cohen had the right to speak out, but not the right to do so with obscene language in public. So when it was appealed up to the court, the Supreme Court appealed it because the obscene language did not oppose a direct insult and wasn't likely to provoke an action. They also feel that it is important that people be free to choose their words, even if words that are offensive can be a part of can be an important part of the message itself. Second case in talk about the importance of fearless press. The New York Times Company versus Sullivan. The New York Times had published an advertisement to support civil rights movement. It criticized the actions of police in Montgomery, Alabama, and the Commissioner of Alabama sued the paper for publishing false statements. The Supreme Court ruled that the newspaper is constitutionally protected despite the false allegations, since the newspaper did not knowingly and recklessly publish the inaccuracies. So the paper had intentionally and recklessly published these statements, then it would be considered unconstitutional. Third case I'm going to talk about is even offensive speech is protected. Brandenburg versus Ohio. Brandenburg is a KKK Klan leader of a branch. He was arrested for advocating violence during a rally speaking of taking revengeance, which is a word he made up, using revenge and vengeance against African Americans and Jews. Again, Supreme Court had to first distinguish between his speech that advocates for criminal action in a general way and a speech that incites immediate crime. If he were encouraging his audience to immediately commit a crime such as loot, riot, or burn down buildings in his speech, then his speech would not be protected. But since there was no actions behind his speech is protected. Something I came across was in the words of the late Oliver Wendell Holmes, stated, defending free speech means defending not just free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought we hate.
Hi, my name is Anastasia, and I'm going to be talking about the legislative and executive orders concerning our topic, which is the freedom of expression. So, due to numerous amounts of cases rising concerning the First Amendment, legislative and executive branches had to come up with different solutions to wisely satisfy the needs of its people. So throughout history, we see how both of the branches were always somewhat wrestling for enacting of certain laws. Since the First Amendment never specified what exactly it meant by freedom of speech, many violations and misunderstanding took place, which then in future resulted in creation of new laws and new orders from the presidents. So people begin to ask, what is freedom of expression? What exactly does it mean? What can I express? And how do I possibly stay inside the limits of what is allowed? An example of such misunderstanding took place in 1919 when, due to a protest, the Supreme Court, followed by the Congress, created a series of cases which helped to better understand the limitations of the free expression. This Espionage Act was one of those limitations where a group of protesters, including these two women, protested that it says, Mr. President, remember the Constitution. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And the political prisoners who believed in this guarantee are now serving 20 years in prison. So due to this protest, Congress did this Espionage Act, which banned interference in any kind of military action or recruitment, which was passed in 1917 after the U.S. joined World War I. Another example was the Tinker versus Des Moines Independent School District decision, where a group of high school students organized a protest against the Vietnam War by wearing black armbands. Later, the students were suspended, and the principal argued, quote unquote, that the armbands were a distraction and could possibly lead to a danger for the students. However, the Congress decided in the students' favor and set a standard for free speech in schools. So that's where free speech and press were allowed from now on in schools. There's a lot, there's numerous amounts of examples from history, but I'd like to focus on the recent example of how freedom of expression is still misunderstood and unfairly controlled today. So in this article I found, published on January 10th of this year, the author explains how Twitter banned our former President Donald Trump from further participation in it. He did have a lot of comments on Twitter, and no matter what the First Amendment stated, Trump, quote, lost the right that every ordinary American enjoys, end quote. That is definitely violating the principle of freedom of speech. So this happened to the president. It can definitely happen to us. So I'm asking myself, can we truly say what we mean? Are we free? Yeah, so that concludes my video about legislative and executive orders concerning the freedom of speech, press, any kind of expression.
Freedom of speech allows us to share our opinions, including those that are offensive to others, as long as we avoid force, fraud, or defamation. So why is it that some groups are allowed to restrict speech and others are not? We don't allow the government to restrict speech because it doesn't have any competitors. It could stamp out all disagreement, leaving no room for opposing views. In general, though, private groups are allowed to restrict speech, membership, and other activities on their own property because there are many other options available to people. Thus, universities can set whatever speech codes they like because students are always free to go elsewhere if they don't like the restrictions. When people aren't prevented from saying what they want to say, it allows for every view to be heard, without compelling anyone to host or pay for speech they disagree with. So, monopolies like the government are not allowed to pick who speaks and who doesn't, but organizations that face competition are free to do so.